Shalom and welcome. It's great to be here with everyone again in person and online. And I want to welcome you to our session tonight. And we, I think, have a very interesting but somewhat different message to talk about this evening. I guess in some ways, for some of you, all of my messages are somewhat different because they might include things that you have not been taught before. But this is going to be in a little bit different mode even for me than the way I usually teach or the topics I usually share. So welcome again, and we're going to start with the lighting of the candles as we always do to welcome in the Sabbath, Shabbat at sundown, and welcome into the Lord's rest. That we remember he said that man was not created for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath for man. Spiritually, we enter into the rest that the Lord gives us symbolically and in reality by ceasing from work during the 24 hours of the Sabbath. And we remember, of course, that Yeshua is the light of the world, and we are to reflect his light and let our light shine. And one of these days, I'm going to find matches that will light more easily. I don't know what to do. There we go. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Shabbat. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with your commandments, and for whom we remember that you are the light of the world, and we are to take your light to this world. Amen. And now, as we also always do, we will open with the prayer that is called the Shema, or Deuteronomy 6:4. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Blessed be his name, whose glorious kingdom is forever and ever. Amen. And you may be seated. And again, welcome to those online. Welcome to those in person. And as I shared before we got started, this evening's message, let me start. Okay, this evening's message is a little bit different than what we typically do, because I am going to combine scripture with American history and culture, because I think it's important as we navigate current events, no matter where you are. This is not going to be a political message. I have very strong political beliefs, but that's not what this message is. This is about biblical foundations of how our nation was founded and the interesting, very Jewish roots of the founding of this nation. And it's interesting too, as I speak with people, both spiritually as in ministry and just neighbors and friends, we all talk about the changes in public education and that kids these days are not getting taught the things that people of my generation were taught. And yes, that's true, but even in my generation, most of what I'm going to share tonight was not taught to us. The neglect, shall we say, intentional and otherwise, of some real foundational parts of American history were never taught to me, even though, again, I'm in my 70s, so I can't say it's based on today's education. Even back when I was in elementary, middle, and high school, and even in college. So we're going to start, let freedom ring. Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. These words are from Leviticus chapter 25, verse 10, and they are inscribed on the Liberty Bell. How many of us were taught in school that a Bible verse is what proclaimed the freedom of this nation? How many were taught in school, even of my generation, that that Bible verse was from the Hebrew scriptures, from Torah, from Leviticus? Interesting, isn't it? Although it was actually built in 1751, it commemorates a concept of religious freedom that was not known previously in other governments. It rang, by the way, on July 8th, 1776, not on the 4th. Something else that is not necessarily taught. In fact, on July 4th, only 2 people signed the Declaration of Independence. Most signed it later on August 9th, and some didn't even sign it for another 5 years because they weren't in the area. Again, very different than what we were taught. Now, what is July 4th? Well, it's the day between the 3rd and the 5th. But beyond that, why do we call that Independence Day? That's the day it was voted that the Declaration of Independence be adopted. But it was not actually signed on that day. But on July 8th, when word that people were starting to sign it, and word got out to the general public that it had been adopted, the bell was rung on July 8th. A Bible verse, a quote from Torah, from the Hebrew Scriptures, serves as one of many biblical foundations of the United States of America. On July 4th, we celebrated the independence of the United States. We learned about it in school. But how does that American story relate to our story? Relate to our story as a people group? Relate to our story of those who follow the Lord? What about culture and tradition? What about our faith? The history of America and the biblical and Hebraic history of America, the Jewish history of America and foundation is very long, and there are many astonishing facts and accomplishments, ranging from Christopher Columbus, and I've taught before that he was a Jew, that's an adopted name as he was hiding, he was a Marrano, to the Revolutionary War, relationships with George Washington, through the expansion to the West, and of course up until today. And I think I'm going to share some facts that you will all find fascinating. At least I call them fascinating facts. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Most of us in this room, and most of you I'm sure online have heard that. We learned it in elementary school as kids. It was taught from early school days. Generations of American students learned it. But there was another, even more momentous event of 1492 that I bet 98% of those of you here and watching have never heard of, or don't realize that it was at that time. And it's called the Spanish Inquisition, when Jews were killed or cast out of Spain, Portugal, and other surrounding areas. What does one have to do with the other? A whole lot. On March 31st, 1492, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella proclaimed that all Jews were to be expelled. Jews were forced to renounce their faith and convert or risk death. Secret Jews who never renounced their actual heritage became known as Marranos, which is swine in Spanish. Several Spanish scholars, such as Jose Iruko Celso Garcia de la Riega, I hope I'm not butchering that name too badly, Otero Sanchez, and Nicolas Diaz Perez, have concluded that Columbus himself was a Marrano. Columbus's voyage was not, as we, including I, were taught in school, it was not funded by the Spanish monarchy. Not at all. Many people, I was taught, Queen Isabella, King Ferdinand gave all the money, sent Columbus on his way. But instead, 2 Jews who were in hiding as Marranos for fear of being killed, and another Jew who everyone knew was Jewish, financed this expedition. Louis de Sentinel and Gabriel Sanchez advanced an interest-free loan of 17,000 ducats from their own pocket to help pay for the voyage. I have no clue what that would translate to in today's monetary system, but I'm sure it would be quite a lot. So did Don Isaac Abarbanel, rabbi and a statesman, and this was written in a 12, CNN article of all places where you would not expect to find this. Columbus signed his last will and testament with an anagram. In other words, letters that if you just took the first letters, it would spell out words. According to British historian Cecil Roth in his book, The History of the Marranos, the anagram was a substitute for the Kaddish, the prayer recited in the synagogue by those who grieve after the death of someone close to them. Therefore, the way Columbus signed it, when his will was said out loud, his heirs could recite the Jewish prayer of mourning and get away with it because they were simply reading his will, the way he put it together. Wow. Finally, Columbus himself left money to support something that he hoped his successors would do, which would be to liberate the Holy Land and establish a nation for Jews. In 1400s and 1500s, Columbus sent money for this purpose. Jews believed that Jerusalem had to be liberated and the temple rebuilt for the Messiah to come. How many of us today know that Jerusalem has to be liberated and we're waiting for the building of the third temple? Columbus knew that back then. He also, on the day that the Jews were kicked out and were told you have to leave or be killed, that is the day that Columbus set sail. Now, do we want to say that all of these things are coincidences? Or perhaps with all of these, we might actually start to think that this might be true, right? Years later, we're going to jump ahead here, but we are going to get to the American Revolution. I promise you that. Years later, in September 1620, the Mayflower left Plymouth, England, carrying 102 passengers. After sailing for 66 days, they reached Cape Cod. Following a very harsh winter in which half of those 102 died, in March that spring, the remaining settlers moved on shore, where they really were very surprised. They received a visit from a Native American from the Abenaki tribe who spoke fluent English. How did that happen? Well, let's think about it. A few days later, this Native American returned with another Native American from a different tribe named Squanto. And some of you might have heard his name before. Squanto had been kidnapped by an English sea captain and was sold into slavery, eventually escaping to London and then returning to his homeland. Squanto taught the Pilgrims how to grow corn, which was not available in England, get sap from maple trees, which they had never done, catch fish in the rivers, including which ones were okay to eat and which ones were not, how to avoid poisonous plants. They didn't have poison ivy in London, but you don't want to make tea out of poison ivy, okay? Now think about this. Think about the biblical story of Joseph, a man who was sold into slavery and then rescued his people by feeding them. Squanto sold into slavery and rescued everyone by feeding them. Do you see a parallel about American history and biblical history? It's, to me, sad that although our money says in God we trust, our nation as a whole has gotten so far away from that. Because when we look at how we were founded, it is not surprising to me why this nation flourished in the beginning, okay? So the Pilgrims, of course, we know the story, invited local Native Americans to the first Thanksgiving in the fall of 1621. Historians believe this occurred somewhere the end of September or in October. It would never have happened the last Thursday of November. If you have ever been to New England, you will know that if you wait until then to harvest your crops, you will starve because they will all have died and rotted by then. And if you think that in the sleet and the snow and freezing temperatures, even if there was no precipitation, in 20-degree weather, do you really think they would have been sitting out picnic style, eating a big feast together? Let's think about that. But what was going on earlier in the fall, the Feast of Sukkot, the Feast of the Tabernacles, the fall harvest biblically. William Bradford, the leader of the Pilgrims, had a Bible. In it, he wrote notes, handwritten notes that had been, and some were handwritten by a different Puritan scholar named Henry Ainsworth, who had written a list of events that require a prayer of thanksgiving. Sick when he is healed, prisoner when he is released, they that go down to the sea, when they come up to land, when they come to an inhabited land. As his authority, Ainsworth quoted a man that in ancient English, pre-modern language, he called Maimonides, which is Maimonides, the Jewish sage that wrote Talmud, that wrote what we would consider halakha, the way to apply scripture to daily life. And that's who he quoted. Ainsworth had copied an English version of Maimonides' code and included the laws of giving thanks. As the Puritans believed and compared the Exodus to their own journey and the crossing of the Red Sea to the crossing of the Atlantic, they made this the way to understand oppression and progress in their own lives and take their story, remember it, and let us live it. Now there's more. According to a website, myjewishlearning.com, in 1654, the first group of Jews arrived in colonial America. 23 Sephardic refugees fleeing Brazil, which had recently been captured by the Portuguese, and sometimes they were called the Jewish Pilgrim Fathers. These Jews docked in New Amsterdam, later known as New York, getting permission to live there along the locals. Up until the American Revolution, Jewish merchants, both Sephardic from the Mediterranean area and Latin America and Ashkenazi from Eastern and Central Europe, established homes in New Amsterdam, later New York, and other American colonial ports, including Newport, Philadelphia, Charleston, and Savannah. But the earliest American Jewish communities were all based in Sephardic customs, which is really interesting because most American Jews today, my own family heritage included, are Ashkenazi. The first American synagogue, Sharif Yisrael, in New York was completed in 1730. And until the 19th century, until the late 1800s, the synagogue made it mandatory that every Jew needs to fellowship with each other. Jumping now to 1776, because remember I told you we're going to talk about independence. So this is some background to how we got here from there. Now in 1776, we know the Declaration of Independence was approved. Liberty Bell rang on July 8th, as I mentioned. A committee was formed to design the new seal. We need a logo. Whenever you get a startup company, what do? You hire a graphic designer to design your logo. So everyone wanted to talk, what's going to be our logo of the United States? This is what Benjamin Franklin proposed. Moses, standing on the shore, extending his hand over the sea, thereby causing the same to overwhelm Pharaoh, who was sitting in an open chariot, a crown on his head, a sword in his hand, raised from a pillar of fire in the clouds, reaching to Moses to express that he acts by command of the deity. That's what Benjamin Franklin proposed to be the Great Seal of the United States of America. Okay? And you can find that in a book called foundersarchives.gov, documents, etc. And I have all the references should you want them later, but you can Google it online and you can find it. Thomas Jefferson, a little bit differently than Franklin, wanted the Great Seal to depict the Israelites in the wilderness, following their flight from Egypt, but before their arrival in Canaan, because he wanted to say that the United States was established based on a journey away from slavery, just like the Israelites left slavery in Egypt, and towards spiritual freedom, just like they left the Puritans because they wanted to actually study according to Scripture, not according to the Puritans left, not wanting to follow the Church of England, okay? I find all of this to be so fascinating. And why weren't we taught this? It's not like we took history. I'm old, but I didn't take history before these things happened. So why weren't we taught? The Revolutionary War came next, as we know. General Washington found it very difficult to find financial support for the Continental Army. It's not that he or the soldiers expected tremendous wages, but clothing, ammunition, rifles or muskets, whatever. They cost money. You don't just presto changeo, there they are, right? They had to do that. So what did they do? They called upon a man named Chaim Solomon. Can you guess his ethnicity based on the name of Chaim Solomon? Although Chaim Solomon was born in Poland, he was a Sephardic Jew who arrived in New York in 1775, 1 year prior. What a coincidence, or maybe God had it planned. He built a financial brokerage business and became very successful. He also became involved in the fight for freedom in the American Revolution. Solomon joined the Sons of Liberty and was even captured twice by the British, but escaped. After he escaped from the second imprisonment, he went to Philadelphia, which was the colonial capital at that point in time. There, Solomon partnered with a man named Robert Morris, who was the superintendent for finance for the Continental Congress. He put his financial skills to work, providing income for the Continental Army. A Jewish man financed George Washington's army. With all the anti-Semitism going on today in this nation, I think it's important to realize that we would not have this nation without Chaim Solomon and what he did, okay? He contributed $650,000 of his own money. Well, that was 1776. By today's standard, that would be close to $21 million. If we allow for inflation and, what money is worth today. He became known as the, quote, financier of the American Revolution and is considered to be one of the founding fathers. In Philadelphia, he became a member of the Mikveh Israel synagogue, or immersion in Israel, which is the oldest continuous synagogue in the United States. Now, if he's considered one of the founding fathers, why weren't we taught about him in school? This is what I mean by saying, yes, today's kids are not learning what we learned, but even we had a very incomplete education. And by the way, everything I'm sharing, the sources and all of that can be found online very easy. It's not even hidden. It's just simply not taught. There is also an account, the American government, by the way, never repaid him, and he died in poverty at the age of 45. But there is a statue of him in Philadelphia. But I grew up going on school field trips in Philadelphia. We lived in southern New Jersey, right across the river, but my dad worked in Philly, and I saw the real Liberty Bell, and I saw the Betsy Ross House, and I saw all of those things. And I grew up in a Jewish area, but they never took us to see the statue of Chaim Solomon. But it's not taught. So one has to wonder why. There's also an account about George Washington during the war and how the meaning of Hanukkah inspired him. We know that the lights of the Hanukkah menorah have served as inspiration and hope and courage. Things, however, looked very bleak or maybe even disastrous for General Washington when the army was camped at Valley Forge during the winter of 1777 to 78. This story states that Washington was walking among the troops when he saw one soldier sitting alone, apart from the others, huddled only over two little flames. Washington walked up to the soldier and asked him what he was doing. The soldier told him that he was a Jew and was celebrating Hanukkah. He shared about the festival commemorating the miraculous victory of Jews many centuries earlier over a much bigger and better equipped, more powerful enemy who wanted to deny freedom. The soldier concluded by expressing his confidence that just as with the help of God the Jews of ancient times were victorious, so would they, the Continental Army, be victorious in this cause and fight for freedom. Reportedly, Washington thanked the soldier and walked back to the rest of his troops, inspired by the tiny flames and knowledge that miracles were possible. The story had been very difficult to verify, but now we know that it is quite credible. In December 1778, General George Washington had a meal in the home of a man named Michael Hart, a Jewish merchant in Easton, Pennsylvania. This was during Hanukkah, and Hart began to explain the customs and history of the festival. Washington recounted that he already knew about Hanukkah, and he told Hart and his family about meeting the Jewish soldier the previous year. According to Washington, the soldier was a Polish immigrant who had said he had fled his homeland because he could not practice his faith under the Prussian government. Louisa, the daughter of the host, Michael Hart, wrote the story down in her diary. The story has been quoted by many historians since that time, most recently in a book in 1977 called Jews on the Frontier. So from that, we know that it's true because this woman wrote it in her diary about what happened that evening. After the war, it was time to really establish the nation. A few years later, General George Washington, now the president, visited Rhode Island, the last of the original 13 colonies to ratify the new United States Constitution. He visited the synagogue there, now known as Touro Synagogue in Newport, which, by the way, still stands. After his visit, he, George Washington, President of the United States at that time, wrote this letter to the Jews. Gentlemen, while I receive with much satisfaction your address, I replete with expressions of affection and esteem. I rejoice in the opportunity of assuring you that I shall always retain a grateful remembrance of the cordial welcome I experienced in my visit to Newport from all classes of citizens. The reflection on the days of difficulty and danger which are past is rendered the more sweet from a consciousness that they are succeeded by days of uncommon prosperity and security. If we have wisdom to make the best use of the advantages with which we are now favored, we cannot fail, under the just administration of a good government, to become a great and happy people. The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more than that toleration is spoken of as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent rights. In other words, it's not based on class. It's not like you're going to be able to have some freedom because I'm going to let you. No, he's saying everyone has this freedom. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. It would be inconsistent with the frankness of my character now to avow that I am not pleased with your favorable opinion of my administration and fervent wishes for my felicity. May the children of the stock of Abraham, in other words, may the Jewish people who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree. He's quoting Torah here, and he again quoted Yeshua when, remember, he recognized Nathanael had been sitting under his vine and fig tree waiting for him. There shall be none to make afraid. May the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness in our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his due time and way, everlastingly happy, George Washington. What a letter from the General of the Continental Army, the first President of the United States. And how many of you, other than maybe if you've heard me speak on it before, how many of you have ever heard it in school or even in a church or anywhere? When your church has celebrations for Independence Day or anything, how many of you have heard this? And yet here we are. See, I told you that this evening's message would be a bit different, but look at this, okay? As the new nation flourished and began to expand westward, Jews migrated within that expansion and became a part of the Wild West with everyone else. Adi Eshman wrote in the Jewish Journal of December 24th, 2019, after the Civil War, a huge influx of Jews arrived at Ellis Island in New York, immigrating, right? They settled on the Lower East Side, started businesses, and formed families. A man named Jacob Schiff started an organization, the Jewish Industrial Removal Office. If you were a Jewish immigrant and you were tired of living in crowded, filthy tenements, as more and more were coming in, it was becoming crowded, the office would resettle you with a Jewish family out west. If you want to go west, you want to get out of this, our office will pay your way to go settle further west. Okay? This is really exciting because wait until you see. Over 75,000 Jews eventually took up this offer. The article continues. Take a woman named Josephine Marcus. The daughter of Polish immigrants, Marcus was born in San Francisco because of this push west and ran away from home at 18 to become an actress. Then she met the legendary Arizona lawman Wyatt Earp. Yes, he was a real man, not just the TV movies and all that. And he was captivated by the broad shoulders, blonde hair, and blue eyes. It was love at first sight. Marcus became his wife for over 40 years. Wyatt Earp had a Jewish wife. I bet none of you, unless you've heard me speak on this topic, none of you have ever heard that one before. After Earp died, she buried him beside her parents in a Jewish cemetery outside Colima, California. Ann Kushner, the executive director of the American Jewish Historical Society and author of a book, The Lady at the OK Corral, said, "We don't know if Wyatt Earp ever went to temple or synagogue, but we know he went at least once to get married." How many of you would ever have known that story? From taming the land and expansion to the West, American Jews have thrived in all areas of life, including entertainment, science, government, and more. More than 300 Jews have won Academy Awards across all the categories. There have been 57 American Jewish Nobel Prize winners, 43 Jewish American Pulitzer Prize winners. The list goes on. American history, Jewish history, biblical principles, let freedom ring, the year of Jubilee, are all intertwined. Scriptural Hebraic history has always been part of the American story. As we have been celebrating American independence, we might want to think about George Washington's letter to the Jews when we see what is going on in our nation today. As we've watched fireworks, and yes, my neighbors believe that they should still be setting them off, we remember the light of our people and the light of God, just as we enact when we light these candles, shining throughout American and all of our history and stories. Quite different than the history that we learned in school. And of course, if I really wanted to teach on any of this in depth, I can do, 2 hours just on Thanksgiving and why it was done the way it was. But an overview I wanted because of the 4th of July because of Independence Day. Isn't it remarkable that it's not just happening in today's education? We were not taught this either. And I can't believe it's all accidental, because the enemy does not want us to know the biblical foundation and the heritage of this country. Because if we understood who we really are, if we understood the Lord's guidance and provision in bringing this nation into effect, I don't think we would take it as lightly as we do. So that is the message for today. And I thank you all. We will meet again 2 weeks from today on the 25th. And thank you for that. As always, I am going to close with the Birkat HaKohanim, or the priestly blessing. And speaking of famous Jewish Americans, Leonard Nimoy, right, in Star Trek, you know his live long and prosper, right? And this is the way the priests were instructed, because this is the sheen that looks, the letter sheen in Hebrew, to place the name. And I actually read this interview by him, and he said, yes, live long and prosper is the Vulcan version of may the Lord bless you and keep you. And he came up with his iconic way of doing this based on what he remembered in the synagogues as a child, since we're talking about Jewish Americans. Yevarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, Ye'er Adonai panav elecha v'chunecha, Yasa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. Adonai bless you and keep you. Adonai make his face to shine on you and be gracious to you. Adonai turn his face toward you and grant you shalom. That's Numbers 6:24 through 26. Shabbat shalom, Sabbath peace, and until we get back together, Lehitraot, or loosely translated, happy trails to you.